The wind howled across the endless prairie, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of danger. The Whitaker family stood at the brink of the unknown. Their wagon wheels sunk deep in the mud of the Mormon Trail. Each crack of thunder seemed like a warning, each gust of wind a whispered challenge. For John Whitaker, his wife Margaret, and their 2 children, Eliza and Samuel, turning back was never an option. Ahead lay the promise of a new life in the Salt Lake Valley, but the trail would demand more from them than they ever imagined, testing their faith, their courage, and their unbreakable bond as a family. For the Whitakers, the answer was clear, but the journey was anything but certain. The Whitakers' modest farm in Illinois had always been their anchor, a place where the soil held the memories of every seed they planted and every storm they endured. But as spring arrived in 1856, the family stood at a crossroads. For John and Margaret Whitaker, their faith as devout members of the Mormon Church was more than a belief. It was a calling. They had heard the stories of the promised land in Utah, a place where they could live free from persecution and build a future for their children. The decision to leave wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The days leading up to their departure were a blur of preparation and farewells. John worked tirelessly to sell their livestock and tools, gathering what little money they could to fund the journey. The wagon, their lifeline for the months ahead, was patched and reinforced under his careful hand. Every creak of the wood reminded him of the miles it would need to endure. Margaret, meanwhile, sorted through their possessions, deciding what to take and what to leave behind. Each item felt like a piece of their history, and every choice was a small heartbreak. "We'll take only what we need," Margaret said firmly as she folded clothes into a worn trunk. "The rest will weigh us down." Eliza, their eldest daughter, watched her mother with a mixture of curiosity and unease. At 16, she understood the gravity of what lay ahead, but couldn't help yearning for the familiar comforts of home. Her younger brother Samuel, on the other hand, saw the adventure in it all. He spent his days chasing chickens in the yard and peppering John with questions about the trail. "Will there be Indians, Pa? And buffalo?" Samuel's eyes were wide with excitement. John smiled, though the weight of his worries pressed heavily on him. "There'll be plenty to see, son, but we'll need to be ready for anything." As the wagon train assembled on the edge of town, the Whitakers said their goodbyes. Neighbors gathered to offer prayers and small gifts: a loaf of bread, a tin of biscuits, a handmade quilt. Margaret clutched each item like a lifeline, her tears silent but steady. When the Whitakers climbed into their wagon and joined the line of pioneers heading west, the reality of their decision settled over them. They weren't just leaving behind a home. They were stepping into the unknown. For better or worse, there was no turning back. The first days on the Mormon Trail were marked by a sense of cautious optimism. The sun rose over the endless prairie, casting golden light across the wagons as they creaked into motion. The Whitaker family, nestled among a group of 20 other families, felt the thrill of starting something new. John gripped the reins tightly, guiding their oxen forward, while Margaret sat beside him, scanning the horizon. Behind them, Eliza and Samuel bounced on the wooden bench, the jolts of the wagon making them laugh at first. But by the end of the first day, the novelty wore thin. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, a vast empty sea of grass broken only by distant hills and the occasional copse of trees. The air was thick with dust kicked up by the wagons, coating their clothes and stinging their eyes. The trail, though well-traveled, was rough and uneven, and their oxen struggled to pull the heavy load. John's hands grew calloused from gripping the reins, his voice hoarse from shouting commands. By the end of the first week, the challenges of the trail became painfully clear. Margaret's carefully packed supplies had to be reorganized after one of the barrels of flour shifted, nearly toppling out of the wagon. Samuel, eager to explore, wandered too far one afternoon and returned with a shallow cut on his leg, a reminder of the dangers lurking just beyond their caravan. The evenings brought a mix of relief and exhaustion. Around the communal campfires, the pioneers shared stories and songs, their laughter carrying across the prairie. Elder Finch, the leader of the wagon train, spoke of the promised land with a conviction that reignited their spirits. Margaret found comfort in these moments, often exchanging quiet words with other mothers about the difficulties they faced. Eliza, however, struggled to find her place. At 16, she felt torn between the responsibilities thrust upon her and the fleeting desires of youth. She often lingered at the edge of the camp, staring at the stars, wondering if the sacrifices they were making would be worth it. As the days turned into weeks, the Whitakers learned that the journey demanded not only physical strength, but also unwavering determination. The trail, they realized, was as much a test of their faith as it was a path to their future. By midsummer, the prairie's wide-open skies turned from a blessing to a menace. The searing sun beat down mercilessly during the day, while violent storms swept across the plains at night. The oppressive heat turned the ground to cracked clay, and the relentless wind carried grit that seemed to find its way into every crevice. Boots, bedding, even their food. The Whitakers pushed forward, but the strain on their bodies and spirits began to show. It was during one such storm that their wagon suffered its first major blow. Dark clouds rolled in without warning, and the wind howled as if trying to strip the wagon train bare. A sudden gust tore the canvas cover on the Whitakers' wagon, exposing their supplies to the pounding rain. John and Margaret scrambled to secure what they could, their shouts lost in the roar of the storm. By morning, they had lost a barrel of flour, some cooking utensils, and part of their bedding. Margaret silently mended the canvas the next day, her hands trembling with exhaustion as she worked. The weather wasn't the only challenge. Illness swept through the wagon train like an unseen predator. Samuel, usually full of energy, grew pale and weak, his small frame shivering despite the summer heat. Margaret stayed by his side, her face etched with worry, coaxing him to sip water and eat what little he could manage. Dysentery was the likely culprit, and the group's limited supplies made it difficult to treat. Eliza took on more responsibilities during this time, gathering firewood, fetching water, and helping other families while her mother cared for Samuel. She found herself growing in ways she hadn't expected, her youthful frustrations giving way to a quiet determination. Yet she often felt the weight of the journey pressing down on her, especially as she watched her little brother's health falter. For John, the hardest part was the feeling of helplessness. Each mile brought new challenges, and every setback seemed like a blow to his resolve. He prayed silently at night, his hands clenched tightly together, asking for strength to guide his family through the trials. The prairie was testing them, wearing them down with its endless hardships. But even in their darkest moments, the Whitakers clung to the belief that the promised land was waiting for them, just beyond the horizon. As the summer heat began to wane, the prairie offered little reprieve. The grasslands turned brittle under the sun, and water sources grew scarce. Despite the challenges, the Whitakers pressed on with the wagon train, their faith pushing them forward. However, late summer brought with it new trials, ones they had hoped to avoid, but knew were always a possibility. One quiet afternoon, the caravan came to an abrupt halt. A group of Native Americans on horseback had appeared on a distant ridge, their figures silhouetted against the clear sky. They sat motionless, watching. A ripple of unease spread through the wagon train as whispers passed from family to family. John stood beside the wagon, shielding his eyes from the sun as he observed the riders. "They're just watching," John said quietly to Margaret, though his hand hovered near the rifle hanging from the wagon. "Let's not assume the worst." The group remained at a distance, their presence a reminder of the land's long history and the fragile balance between settlers and its native inhabitants. That evening, Elder Finch called a meeting, urging calm and reminding the group to be respectful but cautious. For days, the riders appeared intermittently, sometimes close enough for the pioneers to feel the weight of their gaze. While there was no direct confrontation, the tension wore on the group. John couldn't shake the feeling that every step westward brought them closer to danger. It wasn't long before disaster struck, though not in the way they expected. One fateful night, a gust of wind carried sparks from a poorly doused campfire into the dry grass surrounding the wagons. In moments, flames erupted, leaping hungrily from one wagon to the next. "Fire!" someone shouted. The cry piercing the night, chaos ensued as families scrambled to save what they could. John and Eliza worked furiously to unhook the oxen while Margaret grabbed Samuel and the few belongings she could carry. Despite their efforts, several wagons were consumed by the blaze, including part of the Whitakers' provisions. By morning, the devastation was clear. Precious food supplies, tools, and belongings were gone. For some families, it was enough to force them to consider turning back, but the Whitakers pressed on, their faith unshaken even as the trail seemed determined to break them. For John, the fire was a cruel reminder of how quickly everything could be taken, but also of how deeply he had to dig to keep his family moving forward. As the days grew shorter and the air turned crisp, the Whitakers found themselves battling the most unforgiving adversary yet: hunger. The loss of supplies from the fire had left the family scraping by on half rations, and every meal was a grim reminder of how little they had left. Margaret stretched their provisions as far as she could, boiling scraps of meat into thin soups and turning dried berries and hardtack into meager meals. Despite her best efforts, the children's cheeks grew hollow, and even John's strong frame began to look gaunt. The land, once a source of awe, now seemed barren and indifferent. Streams they had counted on for water were dry, their beds cracked and sun-baked. Foraging yielded little beyond bitter roots and withered plants. John took to hunting at dawn, his rifle slung over his shoulder as he walked miles into the wilderness. Game was scarce, and every missed shot weighed heavily on him. One morning, he returned empty-handed, his face a mask of frustration. "I'll find something tomorrow," he promised, though the doubt in his voice was clear. The lack of food strained not only their bodies but their spirits. Arguments became more frequent, especially between Eliza and her parents. She chafed under the weight of endless chores, her frustration spilling over in sharp words. Yet, as soon as the firelight flickered at night, her anger gave way to guilt. She stayed awake long after the others had fallen asleep, quietly sewing patches onto Samuel's worn coat. The air grew colder with each passing day, signaling the approach of winter. The landscape had shifted from the endless prairies to rugged hills and jagged peaks as the wagon train drew closer to the Rocky Mountains. For the Whitaker family, every mile felt like a hard-won battle. Exhaustion etched itself into their faces, and their worn clothes offered little protection against the biting wind. Yet, the thought of the Salt Lake Valley just beyond the mountains kept them moving forward. The trail became steeper, forcing the pioneers to work harder to push their wagons uphill. John's hands were cracked and bleeding from gripping the reins and hauling supplies over the rough terrain. Margaret, her face pale and lined with worry, walked alongside the wagon most days to lighten the load on the struggling oxen. Even young Samuel, still recovering from illness, tried to help by gathering firewood when they stopped for the night. The closer they came to their destination, the more the trail seemed to fight them. Loose rocks made the wagons unstable, and several families lost belongings, or worse, their wagons, to the treacherous terrain. One cold evening, Eliza slipped on an icy path while fetching water from a nearby stream. Her cry startled the camp, and John rushed to pull her back to safety. Though she escaped with only a sprained ankle, the incident left everyone on edge, knowing how unforgiving the trail could be. By the time they reached the last ridge before the Salt Lake Valley, the Whitakers were running on sheer determination. As the wagon crested the ridge, the valley spread out before them, a golden expanse dotted with settlements and framed by snow-capped mountains. Margaret sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face, while John simply stared in awe. "It's real," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "We've made it." The final descent into the valley was both the easiest and the most emotional part of the journey. For the Whitakers, the sight of the Promised Land was more than a destination. It was the culmination of months of suffering, sacrifice, and unwavering faith. Though their bodies were battered and their supplies depleted, their spirits soared. They had survived, and now they could begin anew. The air was sharp with the promise of snow as the wagon train approached the final stretch of their journey. The once rolling plains had long given way to steep, rugged trails winding through the Rocky Mountains. Each step forward seemed harder than the last, the icy ground pulling at the wheels and testing the resolve of the weary pioneers. For the Whitakers, every mile was a mix of pain and determination. They had come too far to turn back now, even as the elements conspired against them. The trail narrowed in places, forcing wagons to creep along the edges of sheer cliffs. Margaret held her breath each time their wagon wobbled on the uneven ground, her hands gripping the sideboards as if her will alone could steady it. John walked beside the oxen, his voice hoarse from encouraging the animals to press on despite their obvious fatigue. The beasts' breath came in heavy puffs, visible in the cold mountain air, and their once strong bodies now looked gaunt from weeks of hard labor. The nights were colder than the Whitakers had ever experienced. They huddled close around the campfire, using every blanket they had to stave off the chill. Samuel, still weak from illness, slept fitfully. His small body curled tightly against his mother. Eliza, her ankle still tender from her earlier fall, worked tirelessly to help keep the camp organized, her youthful energy tempered by the gravity of their situation. The final days were a blur of hardship and hope. One frigid morning, as the sun rose over the peaks, Elder Finch gathered the group to deliver the news they had all been praying for. "Just beyond the next ridge," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "lies the Salt Lake Valley." The announcement brought a surge of energy to the exhausted pioneers. For the Whitakers, the climb to the ridge was the most difficult yet. But when they finally reached the summit and the valley stretched out before them, the sight took their breath away. Fields of gold and green dotted with small settlements lay nestled between the mountains. The journey was over, and their new life was about to begin. Every hardship, every sacrifice, now felt like a distant memory as hope and gratitude filled their hearts. The Whitakers' arrival in Salt Lake City was nothing short of a miracle. The harsh winter winds nipped at their faces as their wagon rattled into the valley. But the sight of the bustling settlement filled their hearts with warmth. Snow dusted the streets, and smoke curled from the chimneys of modest homes, painting a picture of life and community in stark contrast to the desolation of the trail. For the first time in months, they felt a sense of safety, even as the cold reminded them of the struggles still ahead. John guided the oxen through the busy streets, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. Margaret clutched Samuel close, her arms wrapped protectively around her son as she took in the sight of other pioneers who had already settled here. The sounds of hammers and saws echoed through the valley, a testament to the relentless determination of those building this new world. The Whitakers were greeted by members of the local congregation who had been expecting the wagon train's arrival. Warm hands helped them down from their wagon, and kind smiles offered them reassurance. They were led to a communal lodge where they were given hot soup and bread, the first fresh meal they'd had in weeks. Samuel ate hungrily, his small frame visibly perking up with every bite, while Eliza's tired eyes lit up as she warmed herself by the fire. Despite the relief of arrival, challenges lingered. The Whitakers' supplies were almost entirely gone, and they had no land of their own yet. John worked quickly to secure odd jobs, from chopping wood to hauling supplies, to provide for his family. Margaret and Eliza joined other women in mending clothes and preparing meals for the settlement. But even amid their struggles, there was a profound sense of gratitude. They had made it. The journey that had tested their faith and strength at every turn was behind them, and ahead lay the promise of a new beginning. As they knelt together in prayer that night, the family gave thanks, not just for their survival, but for the community and faith that would sustain them in the days to come.